My parents burst into laughter when I told them I was buying the old Henderson place on Maple Street, calling it a money pit, and saying I'd lost my mind after coming back from Afghanistan. "Sarah, that dump is going to bankrupt you," my dad wheezed between chuckles. "You'd be better off burning your savings in the backyard." That same dump just got me a $2 million check from the city for eminent domain. When I showed up to their anniversary dinner with the oversized check in my hands, their laughter died in their throats. My mother's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on their pristine hardwood floor. But by then, I wasn't their struggling veteran daughter anymore. I was the property mogul they'd tried to talk out of success. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I learned early that in my family, your worth was measured by how closely you followed their predetermined path. Growing up in the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, everything had to fit into neat little boxes. My older sister Emma was the golden child, straight A's, cheerleader, sorority president, and now a successful marketing executive with a corner office and a house in the best neighborhood. She never put a foot wrong, never questioned their advice, never took a risk they didn't approve of first. She was their masterpiece, the daughter they could brag about at dinner parties and family gatherings. Then there was me, the one who joined the Army instead of going straight to college like they wanted, the one who chose combat engineering over a safe desk job, the one who came back from deployment with PTSD and a limp from an IED explosion, carrying invisible wounds that made holiday dinners uncomfortable for everyone. I wasn't bitter about Emma's success. She'd earned it in her own way. But I was tired of being treated like the family's biggest disappointment, the cautionary tale they'd whisper about when they thought I couldn't hear. When I first got back, stateside, I lived in their basement for 6 months while I figured out my next move. Those were the longest 6 months of my life. Every morning started with subtle hints about getting back on track and making something of yourself. My dad would leave job listings on my nightstand, safe, predictable office jobs that came with health insurance and retirement plans. My mom would make comments about how Emma was doing so well, how she'd just gotten another promotion, how proud they were of her latest achievement. The subtext was always clear. Why can't you be more like your sister? The breaking point came during Emma's birthday party last spring. She'd just bought her dream house, a sprawling colonial in the suburbs, with marble countertops and a 3-car garage. The whole family was there, aunts and uncles and cousins, all gathered in her pristine living room while she gave tours and accepted congratulations. I sat in the corner, nursing a beer and trying to look interested as she explained her mortgage strategy and property tax benefits. That's when my Uncle Frank, after a few too many drinks, decided to make his annual comment about my life choices. "You know, Sarah," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "it's not too late to go back to school. Emma here proves that with the right priorities, anyone can make something of themselves." The room went quiet. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my reaction. Emma had the decency to look embarrassed, but my parents just nodded along like he was making perfect sense. My mom even added, "Frank's right, honey. You're still young enough to start over. Look at all the opportunities you're missing by not applying yourself." I finished my beer, set the bottle down carefully on Emma's expensive coffee table, and walked out without saying a word. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to spend another day seeking their approval or following their safe, predictable advice. I was going to trust my instincts, use the skills the Army had taught me, and make my own path, even if they thought I was crazy for doing it. That's when I found the Henderson house. It had been sitting empty for 3 years after old Mrs. Henderson passed away, and her estate was desperate to sell. The place looked like something out of a horror movie, peeling paint, broken windows, a roof that sagged in the middle like a swayback horse. The yard was overgrown with weeds that came up to my waist, and there was a family of raccoons living in what used to be the front porch. Most people drove by without even slowing down. The few who did stop took one look and kept driving, but I saw something different. My training in combat engineering had taught me to look past surface damage and assess structural integrity. The bones of the house were solid, good foundation, sturdy frame, quality materials that they didn't use anymore. The location was perfect. 2, right in the heart of downtown on a corner lot that was twice the size of anything else in the neighborhood. Most importantly, I'd heard rumors about the city's development plans for that area. Nothing concrete, just whispers about revitalization projects and infrastructure improvements that could transform the whole district. I spent weeks researching, talking to city planners, studying zoning maps, and analyzing traffic patterns. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. This neighborhood was on the verge of a major transformation. The house might look like a disaster, but the land underneath it was going to be worth a fortune. I crunched the numbers over and over, ran every scenario I could think of, and kept coming to the same result. This wasn't just a good investment, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. When I finally made my decision to buy the place, I knew my family wouldn't understand. They saw a falling down house that would drain my savings and leave me with nothing to show for it. I saw a strategic position in an emerging market that would set me up for life. The difference in perspective was everything, and I knew there was no point trying to explain it to people who'd already made up their minds about my judgment. The day I closed on the house, I drove straight to my parents' place to tell them the news. I was excited, proud of myself for taking a calculated risk that I knew would pay off. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see this as evidence that I knew what I was doing, that I wasn't the failure they thought I was. Instead, I got the reaction I should have expected. My dad looked at me like I'd just told him I was planning to swim across the Atlantic Ocean. My mom actually put her hand to her forehead like she was checking for a fever. "Sarah, please tell me you're joking," she said, sinking into her favorite armchair. "That place is condemned. The city's probably going to tear it down." My dad was already pulling up photos of the house on his phone, showing them to my mom like evidence in a court case. "Look at this mess. The roof alone is going to cost more than the house is worth. And don't even get me started on the plumbing and electrical work." He turned to me with that look I remembered from childhood, the one that said he was disappointed but not surprised. "This is exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making that's been holding you back, kiddo. You've got to start thinking these things through." The laughter started when I mentioned how much I'd paid for it. Not mean-spirited laughter, but the kind you hear when someone tells a joke that's so ridiculous it catches you off guard. My mom actually snorted, which she never did in polite company. My dad was shaking his head and chuckling like I'd just told him I believed in unicorns. $35,000 for that pile of sticks," he kept repeating. "You could have bought a decent car with that money. Or put it toward a down payment on a real house in a good neighborhood." But I didn't need their approval anymore. I'd made my choice based on research, analysis, and instincts honed by years of military training. I knew something they didn't, and time would prove which one of us was right. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I learned to survive in a world where being different meant being wrong. Growing up in the tree-lined suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, our house on Elmwood Drive looked like something out of a magazine. Perfectly manicured lawn, white picket fence, and a 2-car garage that always housed my father's pristine sedan, and my mother's spotless SUV. From the outside, we were the picture of middle-class success. But inside those walls, there was an unspoken hierarchy that determined everyone's worth, and I was always at the bottom of it. My father, Robert Mitchell, worked as a senior accountant at a prestigious firm downtown. He wore the same style of gray suit every day, carried a leather briefcase that he'd owned for 15 years, and believed that life was a series of calculated risks that should always lean toward safety. He'd grown up poor in rural Alabama, and financial security wasn't just important to him. It was everything. Every decision had to make sense on a spreadsheet. Every choice had to have a guaranteed return on investment. He measured success in dollars and cents, and anything that couldn't be quantified was automatically suspect. My mother, Linda, had been a teacher before Emma was born, but she'd given up her career to focus on raising what she called proper young ladies. She threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she'd once brought to her classroom, turning our upbringing into a full-time project. She organized our schedules, monitored our grades, and made sure we were involved in all the right activities with all the right families. Her biggest fear was that one of her daughters might embarrass the family by making unconventional choices, or, God forbid, failing at something public. Then there was Emma, my older sister by 3 years, who seemed to have been born knowing exactly how to make our parents proud. She had naturally blonde hair that caught the light just right, a smile that could charm anyone, and an instinct for saying exactly what people wanted to hear. While I was climbing trees and coming home with scraped knees, Emma was taking piano lessons and winning ribbons at the county fair for her perfectly arranged flower displays. She never had to be told twice to clean her room or finish her homework. She never questioned our parents' advice or pushed back against their expectations. Emma breezed through high school as if it were designed specifically for her. She was homecoming queen, National Honor Society president, and captain of the debate team. College acceptance letters arrived like clockwork. Virginia Tech, James Madison, University of Richmond, each one offering scholarships and honors programs. She chose Virginia Tech for their business program, graduated summa cum laude, and landed a job at a Fortune 500 company before she'd even walked across the stage. Our parents' friends would stop them at grocery stores and church functions to ask about Emma's latest achievements. She was their success story, the proof that their parenting methods worked. I, on the other hand, was the constant reminder that their system wasn't foolproof. While Emma was collecting academic awards, I was getting detention for questioning teachers who couldn't back up their assertions with facts. While she was dating the quarterback, I was spending Friday nights reading military history books and watching documentaries about World War II. I wasn't rebellious exactly, but I was stubborn about doing things my own way, even when my way didn't make sense to anyone else. The differences between Emma and me became most obvious during family dinners, which my mother insisted we have every Sunday regardless of our schedules. Emma would regale everyone with stories about her work projects, her social events, and her carefully planned future. She'd bought a house in the suburbs, was dating a lawyer named Brad who drove a BMW, and had already started talking about wedding, venues, and baby names. She knew exactly where she'd be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Her life was a straight line from point A to point B, with no detours or unexpected turns. My contributions to these dinners were usually met with polite but strained smiles. When I talked about my military training, my father would change the subject to something more comfortable, like the weather or local politics. When I mentioned my interest in real estate investment, my mother would make comments about how important it was to have stable employment before taking financial risks. They never said outright that they disapproved of my choices, but their discomfort was obvious to everyone at the table. The military had been my escape route from their expectations, but it had also confirmed their worst fears about my judgment. I'd enlisted right after high school, much to their horror, instead of going to college like Emma had. They'd spent months trying to talk me out of it, bringing up statistics about women in combat zones and horror stories they'd heard on the news, but I'd already made up my mind. I wanted to serve my country, and I wanted to learn skills that couldn't be taught in a classroom. Boot camp at Fort Leonard Wood was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the first time in my life that I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The Army didn't care about my family's expectations or my sister's achievements. They cared about whether I could do the job, whether I could be trusted under pressure, and whether I had the guts to stick it out when things got tough. For the first time, I was being judged on my own merits rather than compared to someone else's definition of success. I specialized in combat engineering, learning how to build bridges, clear roads, and assess structural damage in hostile environments. The work was dangerous, complicated, and required split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between life and death for entire units. I was good at it. Better than good, actually. I had an intuitive understanding of how buildings and infrastructure worked, how to spot weaknesses that others missed, and how to see potential where others saw only problems. My deployment to Afghanistan was supposed to last 12 months, but it stretched to 15 when my unit was asked to stay for a critical infrastructure project. We were tasked with rebuilding a section of highway that had been repeatedly damaged by insurgent attacks. The work was painstaking and dangerous, with the constant threat of IEDs and sniper fire. But we completed the project ahead of schedule and under budget, earning commendations from our commanding officers and gratitude from the local population who relied on that road for trade and transportation. The injury that ended my military career happened during my final month of deployment. An IED exploded near our convoy, killing 2 of my fellow soldiers and leaving me with a shattered left leg and severe concussion. I spent 3 months in military hospitals, undergoing surgeries and physical therapy before being medically discharged, with a disability rating and a Purple Heart that I kept in a drawer and never talked about. Coming home was harder than leaving had been. The Sarah who'd enlisted at 18 was confident, determined, and ready to take on the world. The Sarah who returned at 23 was dealing with PTSD, chronic pain, and the challenge of rebuilding her life from scratch. The skills I'd learned in the Army, crisis management, structural assessment, strategic thinking, didn't translate easily to civilian job interviews. Employers saw my military experience as either intimidating or irrelevant, and the gap in my resume was hard to explain without getting into details I wasn't ready to share. Living in my parents' basement was supposed to be temporary, just until I could figure out my next move. But temporary stretched into months, and months stretched into a routine that felt increasingly permanent. Every morning, I'd wake up in the same bedroom I'd occupied as a teenager, surrounded by high school trophies and posters that no longer reflected who I was. I'd hear my parents moving around upstairs, getting ready for their orderly, predictable days, and I'd feel like a failure for not having my life together at 23. The job search was a series of rejections and awkward interviews where I tried to explain why someone with my background would be interested in entry-level positions. My father would leave printouts of job listings on my nightstand, administrative assistant positions, customer service roles, data entry jobs that came with health insurance and steady paychecks, but no real future. My mother would make subtle comments about how Emma had never had trouble finding work, how important it was to be practical about career choices, how sometimes we had to take what we could get rather than holding out for something perfect. The worst part wasn't their disappointment. It was their pity. They looked at me like I was a wounded bird that needed to be nursed back to health, someone who required careful handling and lowered expectations. They meant well, but their kindness felt suffocating. I didn't want to be treated like a victim or a charity case. I wanted to be seen as someone with valuable skills and untapped potential, someone who just needed the right opportunity to prove what she was capable of. The pattern of favoritism in my family wasn't subtle. It was a neon sign that everyone could see except the people holding the spotlight. While Emma received encouragement for every risk she took, I got lectures about being more realistic with my ambitions. When she decided to change her major from pre-med to business during her sophomore year of college, my parents called it finding her true passion, and immediately started bragging to neighbors about how she was going to be the next female CEO. When I mentioned wanting to use my GI Bill benefits to study structural engineering, my father sat me down for a 2-hour conversation about how competitive STEM fields were, and whether I was really cut out for that kind of pressure. The double standard became most obvious whenever we both faced setbacks. Emma's failures were treated as learning experiences, while mine were evidence of poor judgment. During her senior year of college, she failed an important marketing class and had to retake it during summer school, which delayed her graduation by a semester. My parents' response was to pay for the extra tuition without complaint and take her on a vacation to reduce her stress levels. They told everyone that the setback would make her stronger and more determined in the long run. But when I came home from Afghanistan with a purple, heart, and a medical discharge, they spent months dropping hints about how I should have chosen a safer career path. Even our successes were measured on different scales. When Emma got her first job out of college, starting at $45,000 a year as a junior marketing associate, my parents threw her a celebration dinner at the fanciest restaurant in town. They invited the whole extended family and spent the evening toasting her bright future and incredible work ethic. The job came with standard benefits, 2 weeks of vacation, and a cubicle in an open office layout, but they talked about it like she'd been elected to Congress. My father made a speech about how proud he was to have raised such a successful daughter, and my mother spent the entire meal calling her friends to share the good news. When I received my military commendations for the highway project in Afghanistan, recognition from commanding officers who said our team's work had saved countless lives and improved conditions for thousands of local civilians, my parents' reaction was markedly different. They listened politely when I explained what we'd accomplished, nodded at appropriate intervals, and then quickly changed the subject to Emma's latest promotion. There was no celebration dinner, no phone calls to relatives, no speeches about pride and accomplishment. My military achievements were filed away as interesting, but ultimately irrelevant, like a hobby that I'd gotten carried away with. The financial support they provided us was another glaring example of the imbalance. Emma's college education was fully funded: tuition, room and board, spending money, even a reliable used car to get around campus. When she graduated and started job hunting, they covered her apartment deposit and first few months of rent to help her get established. When she decided to buy her first house, they provided the down payment as an early inheritance, explaining that it was better to help her while she could really use it rather than waiting until they were gone. My education benefits came through my military service, which meant I'd earned them through deployment and injury rather than receiving them as a gift. But even that wasn't enough to earn the same level of support. When I mentioned considering graduate school, my parents immediately started calculating costs and expressing concerns about adding more debt to what they assumed was already an unstable financial situation. They never offered financial assistance, and when I didn't pursue additional education right away, they used it as evidence that I wasn't serious about my future. The career advice they gave us revealed just how differently they viewed our potential. Emma was encouraged to dream big and reach for the stars, with my parents constantly pushing her to apply for promotions, network with influential people, and position herself for leadership roles. They bought her professional development, books, paid for career coaching sessions, and helped her practice for important interviews. When she expressed interest in eventually starting her own consulting firm, they immediately began researching small business loans and offering to connect her with successful entrepreneurs in their network. My career guidance, on the other hand, focused entirely on stability and safety. They steered me toward government jobs with good benefits, entry-level positions that didn't require risk-taking or entrepreneurial thinking. When I talked about using my military experience and engineering background to get into construction or development, they warned me about the volatility of those industries and the importance of having a steady paycheck. They never suggested that I aim for leadership positions or consider starting my own business. Their advice was always about finding something secure and keeping my head down rather than standing out or taking chances. The social expectations placed on us were equally unbalanced. Emma was celebrated for her active social life, her networking abilities, and her talent for making connections that advanced her career. When she started dating Brad, my parents immediately embraced him as a future son-in-law, inviting him to family events and asking about his career prospects with genuine interest. They saw her relationship as evidence of her good judgment and social skills, proof that she was building the kind of life that would make them proud grandparents someday. My social life, or lack thereof, was treated as another symptom of my inability to adjust to civilian life. The fact that I preferred small groups to large parties was seen as antisocial behavior, rather than personal preference. My reluctance to date seriously was attributed to my military experience and the trauma I'd endured, as if I were damaged goods who needed fixing before I could be expected to maintain healthy relationships. They never considered that I might be choosy about potential partners or focused on other priorities besides settling down immediately. Holiday gatherings became showcases for these different treatment patterns. Emma would arrive with stories about her latest achievements, career developments, and future plans. She'd hold court at the dinner table, with everyone asking questions and offering congratulations for whatever milestone she'd recently reached. Her contributions to family conversations were met with enthusiasm and follow-up questions that showed genuine interest in her success. My attempts to share updates about my life were often met with polite but brief acknowledgments before the conversation moved on to more comfortable topics. When I talked about my physical therapy progress or my efforts to transition to civilian career opportunities, family members would nod sympathetically and then quickly shift focus to lighter subjects. It became clear that my experiences made people uncomfortable, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to respond to challenges that fell outside their realm of experience. The most painful example of this differential treatment came during my cousin's wedding reception last summer. Emma had just gotten another promotion at work, and she spent most of the evening accepting congratulations from relatives who'd heard the news through the family grapevine. People kept approaching her with questions about her new responsibilities, her salary increase, and her plans for continued advancement. She was the star of the family, the success story that everyone wanted to be associated with. Meanwhile, I spent most of the reception fielding well-meaning but awkward questions about my recovery and whether I was feeling better since coming home from deployment. People spoke to me in the careful, measured tones usually reserved for hospital visits, as if I were fragile and might break if they said the wrong thing. No one asked about my plans for the future or my professional goals. They seemed to assume that just getting through each day was accomplishment enough for someone in my situation. The contrast was so stark that even Emma noticed it. Late in the evening, she pulled me aside and apologized for what she called the weird attention she'd been getting all night. She was genuinely uncomfortable with being the center of focus while I was treated like an afterthought. But she didn't understand that this dynamic had been playing out our entire lives. The wedding reception was just a more concentrated version of what happened at every family gathering. She was celebrated while I was pitied. The escalating pattern of unequal treatment reached new heights during what I now call the year of Emma's triumphs, when every milestone in her life became an opportunity for my parents to demonstrate just how differently they viewed our respective worth. It started with her engagement to Brad in February, an event that transformed our family dynamics overnight and pushed me further into the background than I'd ever been before. Emma's engagement announcement was orchestrated like a military campaign. She'd planned the whole thing for weeks, coordinating with Brad to propose at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, complete with a photographer hiding behind nearby tables to capture the moment. The ring was a 2-carat solitaire that had cost Brad 3 months' salary, and Emma wore it like a beacon of her success in securing the perfect life partner. My parents' reaction was nothing short of euphoric. My mother cried actual tears of joy. My father immediately started talking about wedding venues, and they both began treating Brad like the son they'd never had. The engagement party was held at our house 2 weeks later, with my parents sparing no expense to celebrate what my mother kept calling the beginning of Emma's happily ever after. They hired caterers, rented elegant table settings, and invited everyone they'd ever met to witness their daughter's achievement. The living room was filled with flowers, the dining room table groaned under the weight of expensive appetizers, and my father gave a toast that lasted 15 minutes and included the phrase "perfect daughter" no fewer than 6 times. Emma glowed in the center of it all, accepting congratulations and showing off her ring to anyone who would look. My role in this celebration was relegated to serving drinks and collecting empty plates, despite the fact that I was a member of the family rather than hired help. When guests asked about my life, My parents would quickly redirect the conversation back to Emma's engagement, as if my presence was somehow dampening the festive mood. I spent most of the evening in the kitchen, washing dishes and listening to the sounds of laughter and celebration from the next room, feeling like a servant at someone else's party. Just 3 months later, Emma received the promotion that elevated her from marketing associate to senior marketing coordinator, complete with a corner office, a 30% salary increase, and her own assistant. My parents' response was to plan another celebration, this time at the country club where they'd been members for 15 years but rarely used their privileges. They invited extended family, work colleagues, and neighborhood friends to witness what my father called the next chapter in Emma's incredible journey. During that same period, I was struggling to find employment that matched my skills and experience. I'd been applying for positions in construction management, project coordination, and infrastructure development, jobs that would utilize my military engineering background and leadership experience. But the interview process was consistently disappointing, with employers either intimidated by my military background or dismissive of skills that didn't translate directly to their corporate environments. After 6 months of rejections and awkward conversations, I was beginning to question whether I'd ever find work that felt meaningful. When I finally landed an interview for a project manager position with a local construction company, I was excited to share the news with my family. The job would involve overseeing infrastructure projects, managing teams of skilled workers, and ensuring that complex construction timelines stayed on track. Exactly the kind of work I'd been trained for in the military. The salary was competitive, the benefits were solid, and the company had a reputation for treating employees well. I felt confident that my background made me an ideal candidate. My parents' reaction to this potential opportunity was lukewarm at best. My father's first question was about job security, followed immediately by concerns about the physical demands of construction work and whether it was appropriate for someone with my medical history. My mother worried aloud about the male-dominated environment of construction sites and whether I'd be safe working around that type of person. Neither of them seemed to understand that this job represented exactly the kind of career progression I'd been working toward, or that my military experience had prepared me for much more challenging environments than a construction site in suburban Virginia. The contrast became even more pronounced a week later when Emma mentioned in passing that she was considering applying for a director-level position at a competing firm. Despite the fact that this would be a significant jump in responsibility, and she had less than 3 years of experience in her current role, my parents immediately began strategizing ways to help her prepare for the application process. They offered to pay for professional interview coaching, suggested networking events where she could meet potential mentors, and even proposed funding an MBA program if it would make her a stronger candidate. When I didn't get the construction management job, a decision that came down to the employer choosing someone with more specific experience in commercial building projects, my parents treated it as confirmation of their concerns about my career choices. "Maybe this is a sign that you should consider something more stable," my mother suggested, pulling out newspaper clippings of administrative assistant positions that offered health insurance and predictable hours. My father nodded in agreement, adding that there was no shame in starting over with a more realistic career path. The summer brought Emma's housewarming party, another elaborate celebration of her achievements that highlighted just how differently my parents viewed our respective life trajectories. She'd bought a 3-bedroom colonial in an upscale subdivision, complete with granite countertops, hardwood floors, and a 2-car garage. The down payment had come from my parents, presented as an early inheritance that would help her build equity while she was young enough to really benefit from it. The housewarming party was attended by over 50 people, including colleagues from Emma's company, college friends, and several couples from the neighborhood who were already treating her like an established member of their social circle. My parents spent the entire evening playing host, giving tours of the house they'd helped purchase and accepting compliments on their daughter's excellent taste in decorating. They talked about Emma's success as if it were their own personal achievement, the natural result of their superior parenting methods. During this same summer, I was living in a studio apartment across town, paying rent with my disability benefits, and the occasional odd job I could pick up through veterans organizations. The apartment was clean and comfortable, but it was obviously temporary housing for someone still figuring out their next steps. When family members asked about my living situation, my parents would quickly change the subject or make vague references to my transition period, as if my current circumstances were too embarrassing to discuss in detail. The financial disparity between Emma's situation and mine was never explicitly discussed, but it was impossible to ignore. She had received tens of thousands of dollars in direct support from our parents, not including the college education they'd funded and the various celebrations they'd paid for throughout her life. Meanwhile, I was expected to make my own way, using whatever resources I could cobble together from military benefits and my own efforts. When I mentioned that I was considering using my GI Bill benefits to pursue additional training in project management, my father's immediate response was to calculate the opportunity cost of not working full-time during that period. The pattern extended beyond financial support to include emotional investment and social capital. Emma's achievements were shared widely within my parents' social network, with my mother regularly updating friends and neighbors about her daughter's latest successes. She kept photos of Emma's engagement, promotion, and new house on her phone, ready to share with anyone who expressed interest. Her social media accounts were filled with proud parent posts celebrating Emma's milestones and accomplishments. My achievements, when they occurred, were treated as private family matters that didn't warrant broader sharing. When I completed a challenging certification program in construction project management, earning recognition as one of the top students in my class, the news was acknowledged at the dinner table and then quickly forgotten. There were no social media posts, no phone calls to relatives, no proud parent moments that extended beyond our immediate household. The quiet suffering I carried inside me was like a constant weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe during family gatherings and impossible to sleep on nights when I replayed every slight, every dismissive comment, every moment when I was made to feel invisible. I developed strategies for managing the pain that came with being perpetually overlooked. I would smile when they praised Emma's achievements while ignoring mine, nod when they offered unsolicited advice about my life choices, and retreat to my room when the comparisons became too overwhelming to bear in public. The hope that kept me going was pathetically simple. I believed that someday, somehow, they would see me for who I really was, rather than who they thought I should be. Every time I accomplished something significant, every time I demonstrated competence or resilience or strategic thinking, a small voice in my head whispered that this might be the moment when everything changed. Maybe this achievement would finally prove that I wasn't the family disappointment they'd painted me as. Maybe this success would make them realize they'd been underestimating me all along. I kept detailed journals during this period, partly as a therapeutic exercise recommended by my VA counselor, and partly because I needed somewhere to process the cognitive dissonance of loving people who consistently made me feel worthless. The entries from that time reveal a woman desperately trying to maintain her sense of self while living in an environment that constantly challenged her value and potential. I wrote about the crushing disappointment I felt when my parents dismissed my job search efforts, the anger that burned in my chest when they celebrated Emma's routine promotions as historic achievements, and the deep loneliness of being surrounded by family members who never really saw me. One journal entry from March stands out in my memory because it captured the exact moment when I realized how much energy I was wasting on seeking approval that would never come. I'd just completed a freelance project for a local contractor, designing a renovation plan for a historic building that had been damaged in a storm. The work required me to assess structural integrity, research historical building codes, and create detailed specifications that would preserve the building's character while meeting modern safety standards. It was exactly the kind of complex, technical challenge I'd been trained for, and I'd completed it ahead of schedule and under budget. When I shared this success with my family during Sunday dinner, expecting at least acknowledgement of the specialized skills required for such work. My father's response was to ask whether the client had paid me promptly and suggest that I should focus on finding more reliable income streams. My mother added that while project work was fine as a hobby, I needed to think seriously about long-term career stability. Emma, who had just received a routine quarterly bonus at her marketing job, spent the rest of the meal talking about her company's expansion plans and her role in their upcoming product launch. That night, I wrote in my journal about the realization that no achievement would ever be significant enough to change their perception of me. I could win awards, start successful businesses, or solve world hunger, and they would still find ways to minimize my accomplishments while magnifying Emma's. Routine professional developments. The insight was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant accepting that the parental approval I'd craved my entire life was simply not available to me, but liberating because it freed me from the exhausting cycle of hoping for something that would never materialize. The physical manifestations of this emotional stress were becoming impossible to ignore. I developed chronic tension headaches that would start at the base of my skull and radiate forward until my entire head felt like it was trapped in a vice. My sleep patterns were erratic, with nights spent lying awake, replaying conversations, and imagining different outcomes where my parents finally recognized my worth. I lost weight without trying, partly because family meals had become so uncomfortable that I often skipped them entirely, preferring to eat alone in my apartment rather than endure another evening of being treated like a disappointing afterthought. The coping mechanisms I developed were a mixture of healthy and destructive habits that reflected my military training and my emotional desperation. On the positive side, I maintained a rigorous exercise routine that helped manage my stress levels and gave me something to focus on when family interactions became overwhelming. I also threw myself into learning new skills related to construction and real estate, spending hours researching market trends, studying building codes, and networking with professionals in fields that interested me. These activities gave me a sense of progress and competence that I couldn't find within my family relationships. Less healthy was my tendency to isolate myself from social situations where I might have to explain my family dynamics or defend my life choices to people who couldn't understand why a decorated veteran was struggling to find her place in civilian society. I turned down invitations to gatherings where Emma would also be present, knowing that I couldn't handle watching her receive attention and praise while I was treated as an afterthought. I stopped sharing personal updates with extended family members because their well-meaning questions about my future plans felt like additional pressure to justify my existence. The most painful aspect of this period was watching Emma navigate challenges that would have been treated very differently if I had faced them. When she went through a difficult breakup with a boyfriend before Brad, my parents rallied around her with emotional support, practical assistance, and even financial help to make her apartment more comfortable during her recovery period. When I struggled with PTSD symptoms that made it difficult to sleep or concentrate, their response was to suggest that I should try to move past my military experiences and focus on building a more positive future. Emma's professional setbacks were reframed as learning opportunities that would ultimately make her stronger and more successful. When she clashed with a difficult supervisor and considered quitting her job, my parents helped her strategize ways to improve the relationship while also researching other companies where she might be happier. They never suggested that the problem might be with her attitude or work ethic. Instead, they focused on finding solutions that would advance her career goals. When I expressed frustration with the challenges of translating military skills into civilian employment, their advice was to lower my expectations and consider entry-level positions that might not utilize my full capabilities. The emotional labor of maintaining family relationships while feeling fundamentally misunderstood and undervalued was exhausting in ways that my military deployment had never been. In Afghanistan, the challenges were external and clearly defined. Complete the mission, protect your team, stay alive until you could go home. The stress was intense but purposeful, with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. The emotional challenges of family dysfunction were much more insidious because they were wrapped in expressions of love and concern that made it difficult to address directly. I found myself constantly second-guessing my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or misinterpreting innocent comments as deliberate slights. The gaslighting wasn't intentional. My parents genuinely believed they were being supportive and fair. But the effect was to make me question my own experiences and feelings. When I tried to explain how their differential treatment affected me, they would point to examples of times they'd been supportive, as if a few positive interactions could negate years of being treated as the lesser daughter. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of this situation, because it felt like I was the only person who could see the patterns that were so obvious to me. Emma was genuinely surprised when I tried to explain how differently we were treated, not because she was deliberately obtuse, but because being the favored child had made those advantages invisible to her. My parents were convinced that they treated us equally, pointing to the fact that they loved us both and wanted us both to succeed, without recognizing how their definitions of success and their methods of support varied dramatically between us. During the lowest points of this period, I would drive to a park near my apartment and sit in my car, trying to make sense of the disconnect between the person I knew myself to be and the person my family saw when they looked at me. I was a combat veteran who had successfully managed complex infrastructure projects under hostile conditions, but they saw someone who needed guidance on basic life decisions. I was a strategic thinker who could assess risks and opportunities that others missed, but they saw someone whose judgment was fundamentally flawed. The cognitive dissonance was maddening, and there were moments when I wondered if they might be right about my limitations. The breaking point arrived on a crisp October afternoon that started like any other Sunday, but ended with the complete destruction of whatever hope I'd been clinging to about my place in this family. Emma had called that morning, her voice bubbling with excitement about what she described as the most amazing surprise our parents had planned for her. She was deliberately vague about the details, but her enthusiasm was infectious enough that I found myself genuinely curious about what could have prompted such over-the-top joy in someone who was already living her dream life. Arrived at my parents' house around 2 o'clock, expecting the usual Sunday dinner routine of polite conversation, updates about work and social activities, and the carefully orchestrated dance we all performed to maintain the illusion of family harmony. Instead, I found the driveway packed with cars I didn't recognize, and the front yard decorated with balloons and a banner that read, "Congratulations, Emma," in glittering gold letters. My stomach dropped as I realized this was another celebration I hadn't been told about, another milestone in Emma's life that was being marked with fanfare, while I remained perpetually on the outside looking in. The guy scene in the backyard was like something out of a magazine spread about successful suburban families. Tables draped with white linens were arranged around the patio, each one decorated with centerpieces of autumn flowers and flickering candles. A professional photographer moved through the crowd, capturing candid moments and posed group shots that would undoubtedly end up in my parents' annual Christmas card. Catered food was laid out on a buffet table that stretched the length of the deck, and a small bar had been set up near the pool where guests were sipping champagne and cocktails. Emma stood in the center of it all, radiant in a navy blue dress that perfectly complemented her engagement ring, accepting congratulations from what appeared to be every person my parents had ever met. Her college friends were there, several, couples from her neighborhood, colleagues from her office, and extended family members who had driven in from out of state for whatever occasion this was supposed to commemorate. She moved through the crowd like a practiced hostess, graciously accepting praise and posing for pictures with the kind of natural confidence that had always made social situations look effortless for her. I stood at the edge of the patio, still, holding the bottle of wine I'd brought as a hostess gift, trying to piece together what I was witnessing. The banner suggested this was some kind of professional achievement, but Emma had just gotten her promotion a few months earlier and hadn't mentioned any other major developments at work. As I scanned the crowd for familiar faces, I caught sight of my father near the buffet table, practically glowing with pride as he gestured animatedly to a group of his golf buddies about something that was clearly making him enormously happy. My mother appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with excitement, and what I suspected was her third glass of champagne. "Sarah, honey, you made it," she exclaimed, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and celebration. "Isn't this wonderful? We're so proud of her. So incredibly proud." She pulled back to look at me, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "Did you see the pictures? They're absolutely beautiful. She looks like a princess, doesn't she?" "Pictures of what?" I asked, still trying to understand what milestone could possibly warrant this level of celebration. My mother's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face as if she'd assumed I already knew what we were celebrating. "The house, of course," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when explaining obvious things to slow children. "Haven't you seen it yet? Come on, you have to see it. It's absolutely perfect." She grabbed my hand and pulled me through the crowd toward the back corner of the yard, where I could see construction materials and what appeared to be recent landscaping work. As we got closer, the scope of what I was looking at became clear, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Where there had once been an empty patch of grass and my mother's abandoned vegetable garden, there was now a fully constructed guest house that looked like it had been lifted from the pages of a home design magazine. The structure was about 800 square feet, painted in soft cream colors with sage green shutters and window boxes filled with seasonal flowers. French doors opened onto a small covered porch furnished with wicker chairs and decorative pillows, and through the windows I could see hardwood floors, updated appliances, and furniture that was clearly new and expensive. This wasn't just a guest house. It was a complete, move-in-ready home that had obviously cost tens of thousands of dollars to build and furnish. "We wanted to give her something special to help her start her new life," my mother was saying, her words rushing together, in her excitement to share every detail of the project. "It's completely self-contained. Full kitchen, bathroom with a walk-in shower, bedroom with built-in storage, even a little office space where she can work from home if she needs to. The contractors finished last week, and we spent the past few days getting everything set up just the way she likes it." I stared at the guest house, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what I was seeing. This wasn't just another generous gift from parents who wanted to support their daughter's success. This was a major construction project that would have required months of planning, thousands of dollars in permits and materials, and careful coordination with contractors and landscapers. The level of thought, time, and financial investment represented by this guest house was staggering, and it had all been done in secret while I was living across town in a studio apartment, struggling to make ends meet on disability benefits and part-time work. "She deserves this," my mother continued, her voice thick with emotion as she gazed at her architectural gift to her perfect daughter. "She's worked so hard, been so responsible, made such good choices. We wanted to give her a foundation for her future. Something that would help her and Brad get started on the right foot." She turned to me with a smile that was meant to be inclusive, but felt like salt in an open wound. "Isn't it wonderful? Can you imagine how surprised she was when we brought her out here this morning?" The crowd around us was taking turns touring the guest house, exclaiming over the granite countertops, the updated appliances, and the thoughtful details like built-in bookshelves and a wine refrigerator. I watched Emma giving guided tours to small groups, explaining the layout and features with the kind of proprietary pride that suggested she'd already mentally moved in. Brad stood beside her, his arm around her waist, looking like he'd won the lottery by association with a family that could casually construct entire homes as gifts for their children. My father joined us near the guest house entrance, his face red with exertion and champagne, but radiating the kind of satisfaction that comes from pulling off a major surprise successfully. "What do you think, kiddo?" he asked, using the childhood nickname that had once made me feel included, but now felt patronizing. Pretty impressive project, right? We've been working on this for 6 months, keeping it completely secret. Your mother was about to burst from not being able to tell anyone. 6 months. They had been planning and executing this massive undertaking for half a year while I was struggling to find steady employment and wondering if I'd ever be able to afford a place of my own. 6 months of permits and contractors and design decisions and shopping for furniture, all done in secret because the surprise was more important than including me in any aspect of the process. 6 months of Sunday dinners where they'd asked about my job search and living situation, while knowing they were building a complete home for my sister. The photographer approached our little group, suggesting we pose for family pictures with the guest house in the background. Emma and Brad positioned themselves in front of the French doors, with my parents flanking them on either side. I found myself pushed to the edge of the frame, literally and figuratively marginalized in what was supposed to be a family photo. The photographer snapped several shots while everyone smiled and laughed, creating the kind of picture that would look perfect in a frame on someone's mantelpiece, a testament to family success and generosity. Later, as the party began to wind down and guests started making their way to the front yard, I found myself standing alone near the guest house, trying to make sense of the emotions churning in my chest. This wasn't just about the money, though the financial disparity was impossible to ignore. This wasn't even about the secrecy, though. Being excluded from such a major family project was painful in ways I was still processing. This was about what the guest house represented, a concrete manifestation of their belief that Emma deserved extraordinary support, while I deserved ordinary neglect. The guest house was beautiful, functional, and clearly built with love and attention to detail. It represented everything my parents valued: stability, conventional success, adherence to traditional life paths, and the kind of achievements that could be celebrated publicly without embarrassment. It was a reward for being the daughter they'd always wanted, a tangible expression of their pride in Emma's choices and their confidence in her future. Standing in the shadow of that perfect little house, I finally understood that no amount of achievement on my part would ever earn me the same level of investment and support. I could win awards, start successful businesses, or save lives, and it would never matter as much to them as Emma's routine professional milestones and conventional life choices. The guest house wasn't just a gift. It was a statement about whose dreams mattered and whose future was worth investing in. The catalyst that would eventually change everything came in the form of a crumpled piece of paper that my father flicked at me like I was a stray dog begging for scraps. The guest house celebration was winding down, with most of the guests having moved inside to continue their conversations over coffee and dessert, when I finally worked up the courage to approach my parents about what I'd witnessed. My chest felt tight with a mixture of hurt and anger that I was struggling to keep under control, but I knew I couldn't leave without at least trying to address the elephant in the room. I found them in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the celebration with the satisfied exhaustion of people who had just pulled off a major event successfully. My mother was wrapping leftover catered food in aluminum foil, while my father loaded champagne glasses into the dishwasher, both of them still glowing with the pride of parents who had just demonstrated their love for their child in the most spectacular way possible. They looked up when I entered, their expressions shifting from celebration mode to the careful neutrality they always adopted when dealing with me during emotionally charged moments. "That was quite a surprise," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and conversational despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "The guest house is beautiful. Emma must be thrilled." I paused, waiting for them to acknowledge the magnitude of what they'd done, or perhaps offer some explanation for why such a major family decision had been made without including me in any part of the process. Instead, they exchanged a look that I'd seen countless times before: the wordless communication of parents who were bracing themselves for a difficult conversation with their problematic child. "We wanted to do something special for her," my mother said carefully, her voice taking on the defensive tone that always emerged when she felt criticized about her treatment of Emma. "She's been working so hard, and with the engagement and everything, we thought it would be nice to give her a head start on building her future." She continued wrapping leftovers with unnecessary precision, avoiding direct eye contact as she spoke. "It's an investment in her stability, really. Something that will help her and Brad get established without having to worry about housing costs." My father nodded in agreement, his expression suggesting that the logic was so obvious it shouldn't require explanation. "Emma's always been responsible with money," he added, loading another set of glasses into the dishwasher with mechanical efficiency. "We know she'll take care of the property and make good use of it. It's the kind of investment that makes sense for everyone involved." The implication was clear. I was not the kind of person who could be trusted with such a significant investment, not responsible enough to warrant this level of financial support. I felt something crack inside my chest, like a dam that had been holding back years of accumulated hurt and resentment. "What about me?" I asked, the words coming out smaller and more vulnerable than I'd intended. "I'm trying to build a future, too. I'm working just as hard to establish myself, probably harder, given the challenges I'm facing with the job market and everything else." I gestured vaguely toward the backyard where Emma's new home stood as testament to our parents' faith in her future. "Did you ever consider that I might benefit from some help getting established, too?" The silence that followed was deafening. My parents stopped their cleaning activities and looked at each other again, this time with the weary resignation of people who had been dreading this conversation, but knew it was inevitable. My mother set down the aluminum foil and turned to face me directly, her expression mixing pity with frustration in a way that made my skin crawl. "Sarah, honey," she said in the tone she might use with a child who was having trouble understanding why they couldn't have ice cream for dinner. "Your situation is different. Emma has a stable job, a solid relationship, and clear plans for her future. She's ready for this kind of responsibility." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You're still figuring things out, still working through your challenges. It wouldn't be fair to either of you to make the same kind of investment when you're at such different places in your lives." My father nodded along with this assessment, his face showing the kind of paternal concern that was supposed to demonstrate care but felt like condescension. "We're not saying you'll never get there," he added, his voice carrying the false optimism of someone trying to soften a harsh truth. "But right now, you need to focus on getting yourself sorted out before you can handle major financial responsibilities. Once you've got steady employment and you've worked through some of your issues, we can talk about different kinds of support." The word "issues" hit me like a physical blow. They were referring to my PTSD, my struggles with civilian employment, my difficulty fitting into their narrow definition of success, all the challenges I'd been working to overcome while living independently and maintaining my dignity despite their constant undermining of my capabilities. In their minds, these weren't temporary obstacles to be overcome, but permanent character flaws that disqualified me from receiving the same level of support they freely gave to Emma. "So Emma gets a house," I said, my voice growing stronger as my anger began to override my hurt. "And I get lectures about responsibility and getting my life together. Emma gets investment in her future, and I get told to lower my expectations and accept whatever scraps I can find." I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Do you have any idea how that feels? Do you understand what it's like to be treated like the family disappointment while watching your sister get rewarded for doing exactly what you've always done?" My father's expression hardened, his patience clearly wearing thin with what he perceived as an ungrateful and self-pitying response to their reasonable explanation. He wiped his hands on a dish towel with sharp, aggressive movements that suggested he was done with this conversation. "You want to know what your problem is, Sarah?" he said, his voice taking on the edge that had always made me shrink back as a child. "You're always looking for someone else to blame for your situation, instead of taking responsibility for your own choices." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out what looked like a folded piece of paper, which he tossed onto the kitchen counter between us with a gesture that was both dismissive and contemptuous. "You want help? You want investment in your future?" He unfolded the paper, revealing what appeared to be some kind of official document or form. "Here. Maybe this will teach you something about taking initiative instead of expecting handouts." I picked up the paper, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to make sense of what I was looking at. It was a property listing, printed from a real estate website, showing a rundown house with peeling paint and overgrown landscaping. The address was on Maple Street, in a part of town that had seen better days, and the asking price was $35,000. The photos showed broken windows, a sagging porch, and what appeared to be significant structural damage that would require extensive renovation. "That place has been on the market for 6 months," my father continued, his voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that was meant to drive home his point about my unrealistic expectations. "Nobody wants it because it's a complete disaster that would cost more to fix than it's worth. But if you're so eager to prove yourself, if you're so ready for the kind of responsibility we gave Emma, then put your money where your mouth is." He gestured toward the listing with a sweeping motion that encompassed all his frustration with my apparent ingratitude. "Buy it. Fix it up. Show us that you can handle a real investment instead of complaining about not getting handed everything." On a silver platter, my mother had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, clearly wishing she could diffuse the tension that had escalated far beyond what she'd anticipated. "Robert," she said quietly, her voice carrying a warning note that suggested he was going too far. But my father was beyond listening to reason, caught up in his own righteousness and frustration with what he saw as my perpetual victimhood. "No, Linda," he said, his voice rising slightly as he warmed to his theme. "She wants to be treated like Emma. She wants the same kind of support and investment. Then she needs to prove she can handle it. Emma didn't get where she is by making excuses and blaming other people for her problems. She worked hard, made smart choices, and earned our confidence." He pointed at the property listing again, his finger jabbing at the photos of the decrepit house. "There's your opportunity, kiddo. There's your chance to show us what you're really made of." The contempt in his voice was unmistakable, and I realized that this wasn't actually an offer of support or encouragement. This was punishment disguised as opportunity, a way of demonstrating just how little faith they had in my judgment and capabilities. The house in the listing was obviously a disaster that would require far more money and expertise than I possessed, and they knew it. This was their way of calling my bluff, of forcing me to confront what they saw as the reality of my limitations. "Good luck with that," my father added, his voice returning to normal volume but retaining its edge of mockery. "Maybe you'll finally learn something about the difference between dreaming and doing." He turned back to the dishwasher, clearly considering the conversation closed, while my mother continued to look uncomfortable but made no move to intervene or soften his words. I stood there holding the property listing, feeling the paper crumple slightly in my grip as my hands continued to shake with a mixture of rage and humiliation. This piece of paper wasn't just a real estate listing. It was a symbol of everything. My parents thought about my potential, my judgment, and my place in the family hierarchy. It was their way of saying that while Emma deserved a beautiful, move-in-ready home as a gift, I deserved only the opportunity to fail spectacularly while trying to rehabilitate something they considered beyond salvation. But as I stared at the photos of that broken-down house on Maple Street, something shifted inside me. The anger I'd been carrying for years began to crystallize into something harder and more focused. They wanted to see what I was made of? They wanted me to prove myself with this disaster of a property? Fine. I would take their challenge, but not for the reasons they expected. I wouldn't be trying to earn their approval or demonstrate my worthiness for their support. I would be proving to myself that their assessment of my capabilities was as wrong as everything else they believed about me. The transformation that began that night in my parents' kitchen wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was a slow burn that started in my chest and gradually spread through every part of my being, until I felt fundamentally different from the person who had walked into that celebration, hoping for inclusion, and left with a crumpled property listing and a burning sense of purpose. I drove home through the dark suburban streets with that piece of paper sitting on my passenger seat, no longer seeing it as an insult, but as an unexpected gift that had the potential to change everything. For the first time in years, I wasn't fighting for their approval or trying to prove myself worthy of their investment. The shift was subtle but profound. Instead of asking why I wasn't good enough for the kind of support they gave Emma, I was asking myself what I could accomplish if I stopped caring about their opinion entirely. The house on Maple Street might be a disaster in their eyes, but I had skills they didn't understand, and perspective they couldn't appreciate. More importantly, I had motivation that went far beyond their limited imagination. I spent that entire night researching everything I could find about the property, using the same methodical approach I'd learned in the military for assessing complex situations with multiple variables. The listing had been active for 8 months, not 6 as my father had claimed, and the price had already been reduced twice from its original asking amount of $55,000. The house had been built in 1924, which meant it predated many of the building codes that made renovation more complicated, but it also meant the construction was likely more solid than modern buildings if the foundation was still intact. Photographs in the listing told a story of neglect rather than structural failure, which was an important distinction that most buyers wouldn't recognize. Peeling paint and broken windows were cosmetic issues that looked worse than they were, while overgrown landscaping actually suggested that the drainage around the foundation was adequate since water damage would have killed the vegetation. The sagging porch was concerning but potentially repairable if the support beams were still sound, and the roof damage appeared to be localized rather than systemic. By dawn, I had created spreadsheets detailing renovation costs, researched comparable properties in the neighborhood, and studied city planning documents that revealed something my parents couldn't have known when they tossed that listing at me as a joke. The Maple Street corridor was part of a 10-year urban revitalization initiative that included infrastructure improvements, tax incentives for historic preservation, and zoning changes that would allow mixed-use development. The area they saw as a declining neighborhood was actually positioned for significant growth and investment. The realization that I might be looking at a genuine opportunity rather than a guaranteed disaster was both thrilling and terrifying. If I was right about the neighborhood's potential and my assessment of the property's condition, this could be the breakthrough I'd been working toward since returning from deployment. If I was wrong, I could lose my entire savings and confirm every negative thing my parents had ever said about my judgment. The stakes were higher than anything I'd faced in civilian life, but for the first time since leaving the military, I felt like I was operating in my area of expertise. The first step was getting inside the house to assess the actual condition beyond what could be seen in photographs. I contacted the listing agent that Monday morning, explaining that I was a potential buyer interested in a thorough inspection of the property. The agent, a tired-looking woman named Patricia, who had clearly been struggling to generate interest in the listing, was almost pathetically eager to accommodate my request. She met me at the property that Wednesday afternoon, key ring in hand and a hopeful expression that suggested she hadn't shown the house to anyone in weeks. Walking through those empty rooms was like conducting a military reconnaissance mission, with every detail potentially crucial to the success or failure of the entire operation. I tested floorboards for stability, examined walls for signs of water damage, and inspected the basement for foundation problems while Patricia followed, behind me making nervous small talk about the property's potential charm and unique character. What I found was far more promising than the listing photos had suggested. The foundation was solid limestone that had weathered 9 decades without significant cracking or settling. The original hardwood floors were buried under decades of questionable carpet and linoleum, but the few exposed sections showed beautiful oak planking that would be stunning once refinished. The electrical system needed complete replacement, as expected in a house that age, but the previous owners had at least upgraded the main panel, which meant the basic infrastructure could support modern appliances and lighting. Most importantly, the bones of the house were exactly what I'd hoped to find: solid construction using materials and techniques that they simply didn't use anymore. The walls were real plaster over wood lath rather than modern drywall. The ceilings were 10 feet high with original molding that could be restored, and the windows were the kind of substantial wood-framed units that could be repaired rather than replaced. This wasn't just a house that could be renovated. It was a house that deserved to be renovated. The property itself was even better than I'd anticipated. The lot was nearly double the size of typical urban parcels, with mature oak, trees that added thousands of dollars in value, and a detached garage that could be converted into additional living space or workshop area. The location was 3 blocks from the proposed light rail station that was part of the city's transit expansion plan, and 2 blocks from a historic district that was already seeing boutique shops and restaurants moving into renovated storefronts. Standing in that empty house, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and decades of accumulated neglect, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my military service: complete confidence in my ability to handle a challenging mission. This wasn't about proving anything to my parents anymore. It was about using skills I'd developed through years of training and experience to create something valuable from what others saw as worthless. The parallel to my own situation wasn't lost on me. I made the decision to move forward that same afternoon, calling Patricia from my car in the driveway to make an offer. The owners were motivated to sell quickly, and my cash offer of $32,000 was accepted within 24 hours. The closing process took 3 weeks, during which I arranged financing, ordered preliminary inspections, and began planning the renovation timeline with military precision. The day I got the keys to 847 Maple Street was the day I stopped being my parents' disappointing daughter and became something else entirely: a property developer with a vision that extended far beyond their limited understanding of risk and opportunity. I didn't tell them about the purchase immediately, partly because I wanted to avoid their predictable warnings about financial irresponsibility, and partly because I was beginning to understand the power of working in silence while others underestimated your capabilities. The renovation work began that November, with me serving as both general contractor and lead laborer for most of the initial demolition and preparation work. I'd learned enough about construction during my military service to handle the basic structural assessments, and I hired specialists for electrical, plumbing, and roofing work that required licensed professionals. The process was physically demanding and mentally challenging, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that my previous civilian jobs had never been. Every morning, I would arrive at the house before sunrise, armed with coffee and a detailed plan for the day's work. I stripped layers of wallpaper and paint that had accumulated over decades, revealing original architectural details that had been hidden for generations. I refinished hardwood floors that emerged from beneath carpeting like buried treasure, and I restored window casings and door frames that showcased the craftsmanship of an earlier era. The physical labor was therapeutic in ways I hadn't anticipated, providing an outlet for years of accumulated frustration and giving me tangible evidence of progress that I could see and touch at the end of each day. Unlike the bureaucratic challenges of job searching or the emotional complexity of family relationships, renovation work had clear objectives and measurable outcomes. Either the floor was level or it wasn't. Either the electrical work passed inspection or it didn't. Either the roof leaked or it was watertight. As winter progressed, the house began to transform from a neighborhood eyesore into something approaching its original grandeur. Neighbors who had initially been skeptical of the young woman working alone on the property started stopping by to check on my progress and offer encouragement. Several mentioned that they were glad to see someone investing in the neighborhood, and a few shared stories about what the area had been like in earlier decades, when it was considered one of the city's most desirable locations. The work was expensive, exhausting, and sometimes frustrating when unexpected problems emerged during demolition. But it was also the first project since leaving the military that felt like it matched my capabilities and interests. I was using strategic thinking, project management skills, and technical knowledge in combination, creating something valuable while working independently on my own timeline. For the first time since my medical discharge, I felt like I was building toward something meaningful rather than just surviving day to day. By spring, the house was approaching completion, and I was beginning to understand that I had created something far more valuable than my parents could have imagined when they threw that crumpled listing at me in contempt. The neighborhood was already showing signs of the revitalization I had predicted, with new businesses opening and other properties beginning to attract investment interest. My timing had been perfect, my assessment had been accurate, and my execution had exceeded my own expectations. I still hadn't told my family about the project, preferring to work in the kind of focused silence that had served me well during military operations. They assumed I was still struggling with the same challenges I'd been facing when they'd given Emma her guest house, still looking for stable employment and trying to get my life together. They had no idea that I was already several steps ahead of where they thought I should be, building something that would soon prove just how wrong they'd been about my capabilities. The strategic preparation phase began in earnest that spring. When I realized the house renovation was nearing completion, and I needed to start thinking beyond the immediate project to the larger opportunity that was developing around me. What had started as a personal challenge to prove my parents wrong was evolving into something much more significant. A legitimate business venture that could establish me as a serious player in the local real estate development market. Key was positioning myself strategically before revealing the full scope of what I had accomplished. My first priority was documenting everything I had done to transform the property, not just for my own records, but as evidence of the value I had created through careful planning and skilled execution. I hired a professional photographer to capture high-quality images of every room, highlighting the restored original features alongside the modern improvements I had incorporated. The contrast between these photos and the original listing images was striking. What had once looked like a condemned building now appeared to be a showcase property that belonged in a home design magazine. The numbers told an even more compelling story than the photographs. My total investment in the property had been just under $68,000, including the purchase price, materials, professional contractors for specialized work, and permits for the electrical and plumbing upgrades. Comparable properties in the neighborhood that had undergone similar renovations were selling for between $140,000 and $160,000, which meant I had created nearly $100,000 in value through 6 months of strategic work. But the real opportunity wasn't in selling the house immediately. It was in understanding what was happening to the entire neighborhood and positioning myself to benefit from the broader transformation that was already underway. The city's revitalization plans were moving faster than originally projected, with the light rail construction beginning ahead of schedule and several major employers announcing plans to relocate offices to the downtown corridor. Property values throughout the area were starting to rise, and investors from outside the region were beginning to take notice of the potential returns available in what had previously been considered a declining neighborhood. I began acquiring additional properties before the market fully recognized what was happening. Using the equity I had built in the Maple Street house as collateral, I was able to secure financing for 2 more renovation projects within a 4-block radius. The second property was a duplex that needed similar restoration work to what I had done on Maple Street, while the third was a small commercial building that could be converted to mixed-use development under the new zoning regulations. The work was intense and demanding, requiring me to coordinate multiple renovation projects simultaneously while maintaining the quality standards I had established with my first property. I was functioning as developer, project manager, and general contractor across 3 different sites, managing budgets, timelines, and subcontractors with the kind of systematic approach I had learned during military operations. The scale of what I was attempting would have been overwhelming for someone without my background in handling complex logistics under pressure. Each morning began with site visits to all 3 properties, assessing progress from the previous day and identifying any issues that needed immediate attention. I maintained detailed spreadsheets, tracking expenses, timelines, and quality control metrics for every aspect of each renovation. The project management skills I had developed in the Army proved invaluable as I juggled permit applications, material, deliveries, contractor schedules, and inspection appointments across multiple locations. The physical demands of the work were considerable, but I had maintained the fitness standards from my military service and found that the combination of manual labor and strategic thinking provided exactly the kind of challenging, purposeful activity I had been missing in civilian life. Unlike the frustrating cycle of job applications and interviews I had endured after my discharge, this work provided immediate feedback and measurable progress that I could see and quantify at the end of each day. By late summer, the transformation of all 3 properties was generating attention from neighbors, city officials, and other investors who were beginning to recognize the quality of work I was producing. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the neighborhood revitalization, highlighting my projects as examples of the kind of thoughtful development that was changing the character of the area. The article included quotes from city planners, who praised my approach to historic preservation, combined with modern functionality. The publicity brought opportunities I hadn't anticipated. Other property owners in the neighborhood began approaching me about potential renovation projects, and a regional development firm contacted me about partnering on larger-scale investments in the area. Real estate agents started referring clients who were interested in purchasing renovated properties, and I found myself with a waiting list of potential buyers for houses I hadn't even acquired yet. More importantly, city officials were beginning to take notice of my work and its impact on the broader revitalization efforts. The planning department invited me to participate in discussions about future development guidelines, recognizing that my combination of military project management experience and hands-on renovation skills gave me unique insights into both the challenges and opportunities facing the neighborhood. The financial results exceeded even my most optimistic projections. The duplex sold for $215,000, nearly double what I had invested in the property, while the commercial building was generating rental income that more than covered my loan payments with enough profit left over to fund additional investments. The Maple Street house, which I had decided to keep as a rental property, was commanding premium rates from tenants who appreciated the quality of the renovation and the improving neighborhood dynamics. By October, less than a year after my parents had thrown that property listing at me as a joke, I had built a real estate portfolio worth over $600,000 and established myself as a recognized developer in the local market. The business was generating enough income to support my living expenses, while also providing capital for continued expansion, and I was receiving regular inquiries about new investment opportunities. The success was gratifying on multiple levels, but the most important aspect was how it had changed my relationship with risk, challenge, and my own capabilities. I had proven to myself that my military training and instincts were directly applicable to civilian entrepreneurship, and that my ability to see potential where others saw only problems was a valuable skill rather than misguided optimism. I was no longer the struggling veteran who needed guidance and lowered expectations. I was a successful businesswoman who had created value through strategic thinking and disciplined execution. The timing felt perfect for revealing the full scope of what I had accomplished to my family, particularly since they were still operating under the assumption that I was the same person who had left their anniversary celebration carrying a crumpled property listing and a bruised ego. They had no idea that their dismissive gesture had actually provided the catalyst for the most successful period of my adult life, or that their assessment of my judgment and capabilities had been so completely wrong. I began planning the revelation, carefully, understanding that the impact would be maximized by choosing the right moment and setting for maximum effect. This wasn't about revenge exactly, but it was about correcting their misconceptions and establishing a new dynamic based on demonstrated results rather than their preconceived notions about my limitations. The house that they had assumed would bankrupt me was about to become the foundation for a conversation that would change everything between us. The opportunity I had been waiting for came in the form of an invitation to Emma's engagement party, a formal affair being held at the country club where my parents had been members for over a decade. The guest list would include all the same people who had witnessed my humiliation at the guest house celebration, plus additional family friends and business associates who represented my parents' social and professional network. It would be the perfect venue for demonstrating just how dramatically my circumstances had changed since that October evening when they had written me off as a hopeless case. The perfect storm for my confrontation began assembling in mid-November, when Emma announced that she and Brad were moving up their engagement party to coincide with Thanksgiving weekend, creating what she called a gratitude celebration that would bring together both sides of their families, plus all the friends and colleagues who had been part of their journey toward marriage. The venue was the Riverside Country Club, the same establishment where my parents had celebrated Emma's promotion and where they had been members since before I was born, lending an air of established respectability to what was already shaping up to be the social event of their season. The invitation arrived at my apartment on expensive cardstock with gold embossing, formally requesting my presence at an evening of cocktails, dinner, and dancing in honor of Emma Catherine Mitchell and Bradford James Sullivan. The language was appropriately elegant for the setting, and the guest list that Emma had excitedly shared with me over the phone included every person who had witnessed my humiliation at the guest house celebration, plus additional family members, business associates of both my parents and Brad's family, and several couples from their exclusive social circle who represented the pinnacle of suburban success. What Emma didn't know, and what my parents certainly couldn't have anticipated, was that this gathering would provide the ideal opportunity for me to demonstrate just how completely their assessment of my potential had been proven wrong. The timing was perfect. My real estate portfolio was performing beyond my most optimistic projections. I had just closed on my 4th renovation project, and the local business journal was preparing to run a feature story about emerging entrepreneurs in the development sector that would include a prominent profile of my work in the Maple Street corridor. Spent several weeks preparing for this moment with the same methodical approach I had brought to my property renovations, understanding that the impact would depend entirely on execution and timing. The revelation needed to be dramatic enough to create lasting impression, but subtle enough to avoid appearing vindictive or desperate for attention. I wanted to demonstrate success through confidence and evidence, rather than through boastful declarations that might be dismissed as exaggeration or wishful thinking. The first element of my preparation involved arranging for the proper documentation to support my claims about what I had accomplished. I requested official property assessments from the county recorder's office, showing the current market values of my holdings, compiled profit and loss statements from my accountant that detailed the returns I had generated on each investment, and obtained letters of reference from city officials and business partners who could attest to the scope and quality of my work in the neighborhood revitalization efforts. More importantly, I arranged for physical evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or minimize. The feature story in the business journal was scheduled to publish the week of the engagement party, providing third-party validation of my success that couldn't be attributed to family bias or personal exaggeration. I also arranged for the photographer who had documented my renovation work to prepare a portfolio showing the before and after images of all my properties, creating a visual narrative that would demonstrate the scale and quality of what I had accomplished. The strategic element that I was most proud of involved the guest house property that had been the catalyst for this entire journey. Using connections I had developed through my renovation work, I had learned that the city was considering several properties in my parents' neighborhood for potential acquisition as part of an infrastructure expansion project related to the light rail development. The guest house lot, with its large size and corner location, was among the properties being evaluated for potential purchase through eminent domain proceedings. I had quietly retained a consultant who specialized in eminent domain valuations to assess what the city might offer for properties in that area, and the preliminary estimates suggested that corner lots with existing structures could command offers in the range of $1 to $2 million depending on the specific development, plans that were ultimately approved. The irony was almost too perfect. The guest house that my parents had built as a symbol of Emma's success and my inadequacy might actually be worth far more than they had ever imagined, but for reasons that had nothing to do with their investment or Emma's achievements. The week leading up to the engagement party, I made final preparations that would ensure maximum impact for my revelation. I arranged for my attorney to prepare legal documents showing the structure and value of my real estate holdings, requested bank statements that would verify my financial position, and even commissioned a professional appraisal of the Maple Street property that had started everything. The total documentation filled a leather portfolio that would provide concrete evidence for every claim I planned to make. More subtly, I arranged for several key people to be aware of my success story before the engagement party, ensuring that the information would circulate naturally rather than requiring me to dominate conversations with self-promotional declarations. I had lunch with my cousin Jennifer, who was married to one of Brad's colleagues and would be attending the party, and casually mentioned some of the details about my recent business success. I also spoke with Patricia, the real estate agent, who had sold me the original property, knowing that she moved in the same social circles as many of the party guests and would likely share the story of my remarkable transformation. The morning of the engagement party, the Business Journal feature story was published online with the headline, "Local Veteran Transforms Neighborhood Through Strategic Development," accompanied by professional photographs of my renovated properties and quotes from city officials, praising my contribution to the urban revitalization efforts. The article included specific details about my investment returns, my project management approach, and my plans for continued expansion in the development sector. My transformation were already beginning to circulate through the party before I had spoken to anyone about my recent achievements. The stage was perfectly set for a revelation that would challenge every assumption they had made about my capabilities and potential. I spent the first hour of the party moving quietly through the crowd, greeting family members and family friends with the kind of polite conversation that had always characterized my role at these gatherings. But unlike previous events where I had felt like an afterthought or charity case, I now moved with the confidence of someone who had achieved significant success on her own terms and was simply waiting for the right moment to share that success with people who had consistently underestimated her potential. The moment I had been preparing for was approaching, and I could feel the anticipation building as more guests became aware of the story that was about to unfold. Everything was positioned perfectly for a confrontation that would fundamentally alter the family dynamics that had shaped my entire adult life. The moment of truth arrived with the kind of dramatic timing that couldn't have been orchestrated. Better if I had written the script myself. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of wine and making polite conversation with my Aunt Carol about her recent retirement plans, when I noticed a commotion developing near the entrance to the main dining room. A small group of guests had gathered around someone's phone, their voices rising with excitement as they passed the device from person to person, pointing at the screen and making comments that I couldn't quite make out from across the room. The why. Disturbance grew larger as more people joined the group, their expressions shifting from casual interest to genuine surprise as they absorbed whatever information was being shared. I recognized several faces in the crowd, neighbors from my parents' subdivision, colleagues from my father's accounting firm, and family friends who had known me since childhood but hadn't seen me in months. Their animated discussion was beginning to draw attention from other parts of the party, including my parents, who were approaching the group with the kind of concerned curiosity that hosts display when something unexpected threatens to disrupt their carefully planned event. My cousin Jennifer caught my eye from across the room and began making her way toward me, her expression mixing excitement with what appeared to be barely contained amusement. She had clearly been the source of whatever information was causing the stir, and from the way she was moving through the crowd, it was obvious that she was eager to share the details with me directly. Behind her, I could see my parents examining the phone that was being passed around, their faces displaying the kind of confusion that comes with encountering information that doesn't fit into their existing understanding of reality. "Sarah," Jennifer said when she reached me, her voice pitched low but vibrating with excitement. "You are not going to believe what's happening right now. Mrs. Henderson from your parents' neighborhood just showed everyone the business journal article about your real estate work, and people are absolutely losing their minds." She gestured toward the growing crowd near the dining room entrance, where my parents were now standing at the center of attention, fielding questions that they clearly couldn't answer. "Your mom looks like she's seen a ghost, and your dad keeps asking people to repeat what they just said because he can't believe what he's hearing." The ripple effect of the revelation was spreading through the party like wildfire, with guests who had been scattered throughout the country club's various rooms now converging on the main area where the news was being discussed. I could see Emma and Brad making their way toward the commotion, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to genuine concern as they realized that whatever was happening was significant enough to overshadow their engagement celebration. The carefully orchestrated flow of the evening was being disrupted by information that my parents had never anticipated would surface at their daughter's party. Mrs. Henderson, a distinguished woman in her 70s who lived 3 houses down from my parents and served on the board of their homeowners association, was holding court near the bar, her voice carrying clearly across the room as she shared details from the Business Journal article with anyone within earshot. "I had no idea Robert and Linda's daughter was the one behind all that beautiful renovation work on Maple Street," she was saying, her tone mixing admiration with surprise. "The article says she's created over $500,000 in property value in less than a year, and the city planning department considers her one of the most successful young developers in the revitalization project." The information was clearly news to my parents, whose faces were displaying a progression of emotions that I found fascinating to observe from my position across the room. My father's expression had moved from confusion to disbelief to something approaching shock as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. My mother was asking questions in a voice that carried just far enough for me to hear the edge of panic that crept in when she realized how completely out of touch they had been with my actual circumstances. "But that can't be right," my mother was saying to Mrs. Henderson, her voice taking on the kind of strained politeness that she used when trying to maintain social composure while dealing with information that challenged her fundamental assumptions. "Sarah is still looking for steady employment. She's been struggling to get established since she left the military. There must be some mistake." The pause in her sentence revealed her discomfort with discussing my military service in this social setting, even as she was being forced to confront evidence that my experiences had been far more valuable than she had understood. I arrived at the Riverside Country Club that evening, wearing a simple black dress that I had purchased specifically for this occasion, elegant enough to fit the formal setting, but understated enough to avoid appearing as though I was trying too hard to impress anyone. I carried the leather portfolio containing all my documentation, not because I planned to distribute copies to party guests, but because I wanted to have concrete evidence available if anyone questioned the scope of what I had accomplished. Country Club itself was decorated with seasonal flowers and elegant lighting that created exactly the kind of sophisticated atmosphere my parents preferred for their important social events. Emma looked radiant in a navy cocktail dress, accepting congratulations and showing off her engagement ring to anyone who expressed interest, while Brad stood beside her with the confident demeanor of someone who had successfully navigated the complex social dynamics of marrying into an established family. My parents were in their element, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of experienced hosts, introducing Emma and Brad to business associates and family friends who represented the pinnacle of their social aspirations. They had clearly spared no expense for this celebration. From the premium bar service to the elaborate dinner menu, And the guest list represented a carefully curated collection of people whose opinion mattered to them both professionally and personally. What they didn't anticipate was that several guests had already heard about my business success through the various channels I had carefully cultivated, and that conversations about Mrs. Henderson consulted the phone again, reading directly from the article with the kind of authority that comes from having access to published information rather than family assumptions. According to this story, she's already completed 4 major renovation projects and has established herself as a key player in the downtown corridor development. The reporter interviewed her extensively about her project management background and her strategic approach to identifying undervalued properties with high potential for appreciation. She looked up from the phone with an expression that suggested she was impressed by what she had read. "It sounds like she's been quite busy building a very successful business." The crowd around my parents was growing larger as more guests became aware of the conversation, and I could see that my father was beginning to realize the magnitude of his miscalculation about my capabilities and circumstances. His face was flushed with what I recognized as embarrassment, mixed with confusion, and he was asking questions in a voice that suggested he was trying to understand how such significant developments could have occurred without his knowledge. The man who had thrown that property listing at me as a joke was now learning that his gesture had actually provided the foundation for exactly the kind of success he had always claimed I was incapable of achieving. Emma and Brad had reached the edge of the crowd, and I could see Emma's expression shifting from confusion to something approaching alarm as she began to understand that her engagement party was being overshadowed by news about her sister's achievements. This was supposed to be her evening, her moment to be celebrated and admired by the family's social circle. But instead, the conversation had shifted to focus on developments that she hadn't known about and accomplishments that were clearly more significant than anyone had anticipated. "I don't understand," Emma was saying to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying the kind of bewildered frustration that comes with discovering that your understanding of reality has been fundamentally incorrect. Sarah didn't tell us about any of this. We thought she was still having trouble finding work, still trying to figure out what to do with her life. She looked around the crowd as if hoping someone could provide an explanation that would make sense of the contradiction between what they had believed and what was apparently true. That was my cue. I set down my wine glass and began walking toward the center of the commotion, feeling the weight of every eye in the room as people realized that the subject of their discussion was approaching. The conversations gradually quieted as I got closer, creating a bubble of expectant silence around the group that had been so animatedly discussing my business success just moments before. My parents' faces when they saw me approaching were studies in shock and disbelief, as if they were seeing me for the first time and trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the information they had just received. "Hello, everyone," I said calmly, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over this section of the party. "I couldn't help but notice that you were discussing the Business Journal article. I hope the reporter got the details right. Sometimes these media pieces can get a little carried away with the success stories." I paused, letting the implication sink in that the article's claims about my achievements were not only accurate but potentially understated. My father was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident tone. "Sarah," he said, his eyes never leaving my face as if he was looking for some sign that this was all an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. Is this article really about you? About what you've been doing with that house on Maple Street?" The question was loaded with implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. He was asking whether everything he thought he knew about my capabilities and circumstances had been completely wrong. "The house you gave me the listing for?" I replied, reaching into my purse to pull out a folded copy of the original property listing that he had thrown at me 11 months earlier. The paper was worn from being carried in my wallet, but it was clearly the same document, complete with his handwritten notes in the margins where he had calculated renovation costs and marked it as a money pit. I held it up so that everyone in the group could see it, creating a visual connection between his dismissive gesture and my subsequent success. "You kept it," my mother said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared at the crumpled listing that had started everything. The realization that I had not only taken their challenge seriously, but had turned it into a spectacular success, was clearly overwhelming her ability to process the information. The woman who had been so confident about my limitations was now confronting evidence that her assessment had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, publicly wrong. "I did more than keep it," I said, my voice remaining calm and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I bought the property 3 days after you gave me that listing, closed on it for $32,000, spent 6 months renovating it using the project management skills I learned in the Army, and turned it into the anchor property for a real estate portfolio that's now worth over $600,000. The numbers landed like physical blows, each detail more devastating than the last as the full scope of my success became clear to everyone present. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see my parents processing the implications of what I had just revealed. Not only had I succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but I had done so using the exact property they had given me as a symbol of my poor judgment and unrealistic aspirations. The house they had expected to bankrupt me had instead become the foundation for a level of financial success that exceeded anything they had achieved at my age. Emma was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of shock, confusion, and what might have been respect. The sister who had always been held up as the model of success was now confronting the reality that her struggling sibling had quietly built something far more impressive than her corporate achievements and suburban stability. The dynamic that had defined our entire relationship was being rewritten in real time, in front of an audience that included everyone who mattered to our family's social identity. $600,000, my father repeated, his voice hollow with disbelief. The man who had lectured me about financial responsibility and realistic expectations was now learning that I had created more wealth in 11 months than he had accumulated through decades of careful, conservative investing. The irony was so complete that it felt almost theatrical, except for the very real shock and embarrassment written across his face. Mrs. Henderson broke the silence by consulting her phone again, reading additional details from the article that made the scope of my success even clearer. According to this piece, the city planning department credits her work with catalyzing the entire neighborhood transformation, and there are already investors from outside the region trying to partner with her on larger projects. She looked up from the screen with genuine admiration. It sounds like she's not just succeeded, she's become a leader in the local development community. The revelation was complete, but the full impact was just beginning to register. For the first time in my adult life, I was standing in front of my family's social circle, not as the disappointing daughter who needed guidance and lowered expectations, but as a successful entrepreneur whose achievements exceeded anything they had thought possible. The power dynamic that had defined every family interaction for years had been completely reversed, and they were only beginning to understand what that meant for our relationships going forward. The aftermath of that revelation changed everything between us forever. My parents spent the rest of the evening fielding questions about my success from guests who couldn't understand how they had been so unaware of their daughter's achievements. Emma's engagement party became a celebration of my business accomplishments, with people approaching me throughout the night to discuss investment opportunities and development strategies. 3 weeks later, the phone call came that completed my vindication in the most poetic way possible. The city had finalized their eminent domain plans, and my parents' guest house, the symbol of Emma's worthiness and my inadequacy, was being acquired for the light rail expansion project. The compensation offer was $2.1 million for the property and structures. My parents called me in shock, finally understanding that the daughter they had dismissed as financially irresponsible had been right about property values and market trends all along. They asked if I could help them navigate the legal process, since I now had experience with city development projects that they lacked. I helped them, of course. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because I had learned that success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. The house that was supposed to teach me about failure had instead taught me about the power of seeing opportunity where others see obstacles. Today, my real estate portfolio is worth over $3 million, and I've been invited to serve on the City Planning Commission. Emma and I have rebuilt our relationship based on mutual respect rather than competition. My parents still don't fully understand how they missed the signs of my success, but they've learned to trust my judgment. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person they said you'd never be. If you enjoyed this story of transformation and vindication, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of people who turned their biggest challenges into their greatest victories. What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments below.